What if the things we discovered were never meant to be found? What if the Middle Ages, that long, dim corridor between ancient certainty and modern confidence, stumbled into rooms that history would have preferred to keep locked? Not because the knowledge was wrong, but because it was true. And truth, it turns out, has always been the most dangerous thing a civilization can hold. There is a particular kind of discovery that changes everything and improves nothing. The kind that arrives before the wisdom required to handle it. The kind that opens a door and then stands there, offering no instructions for what comes next. The medieval world was full of these moments. Quiet, catastrophic, irreversible moments where someone leaned in a little too close, pulled back a little too late, and understood something they could never understand. Tonight, we open those files. We read the records that history kept but never quite celebrated. The discoveries that were made, that mattered, that shaped the world you are lying in right now, and that the people who made them might, in their quieter moments, have wished they hadn't. Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of journeys, to the places where history becomes strange and familiar all at once, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you are listening in the dark somewhere, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. There is something worth imagining about this silence stretching across the world, all of us gathered in the same archive at different hours, drawn to the same unanswered questions. Now let the lights dim a little further. Let the sounds of wherever you are soften and recede, and let us ease into the night together. The medieval world is often imagined as a place of rigid certainty. God was in his heaven. The king was on his throne. The body was a vessel, temporary and subordinate to the soul. The earth was the center of everything. The stars moved in perfect spheres. The universe was legible, ordered, and explained. People knew where they stood, not because they had proven it, but because they had been told, and telling, in the Middle Ages, carried enormous weight. And then, slowly, one by one, the certainties began to crack. Not all at once, not in a single revolution, but in small, quiet, irreversible moments scattered across 5 centuries and a dozen different fields of human endeavor. A physician who looked more carefully than he was supposed to. A miner who noticed something wrong with the air. A craftsman who began to wonder why his hands trembled. A scholar who held a map and saw, outlined in faded ink, a coastline that no one had yet been told existed. Each of these moments was a discovery, and each of them, in its own way, was a kind of wound. Consider what it means to live inside a complete explanation of the world, to have, at every turn, an answer that satisfies, a reason for illness, a reason for suffering, a reason for the arrangement of the stars and the behavior of kings and the proper conduct of a human life from birth to death and beyond. The medieval world offered this. It offered a totality of explanation that the modern world, for all its knowledge, cannot quite match. And there is a comfort in totality, even when the totality is wrong. Perhaps especially when it is wrong, because wrongness, when it is consistent and shared and reinforced by every institution around you, feels exactly like truth. The discoveries we are going to examine tonight did not arrive as liberations. They arrived as intrusions, as unwelcome guests in a house that had been carefully arranged to keep them out. And the people who made them, or who were made by them, often had no idea what to do with what they had found. Let us begin with the body, because that is where so many medieval discoveries began. With the body, which was everywhere, which was inescapable, and which was, for the longest time, considered too sacred, too dangerous, or too philosophically inconvenient to examine closely. For most of the medieval period, the interior of the human body was largely a matter of inherited theory. The ancient Greeks had proposed a system of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And this system had been accepted, copied, taught, and defended for over 1,000 years without anyone feeling particularly compelled to check whether it was accurate. The body was understood the way a locked room is understood, by the description on the door, not by what lay inside. The humoral system was elegant. It was complete. It connected the interior of the human body to the seasons, to the elements, to the movements of the planets. Blood was warm and moist, associated with spring and air. Yellow bile was warm and dry, associated with summer and fire. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with autumn and earth. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with winter and water. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. Treatment was the restoration of equilibrium through diet, through purging, through bleeding, through the application of substances that counteracted the excess humour. It was a system that could explain almost anything, and that, paradoxically, was its greatest weakness. A system that can explain anything cannot be disproven by anything. Every outcome confirmed the theory. The patient recovered because the balance was restored. The patient died because the imbalance was too severe, or because the treatment came too late, or because the stars were unfavourable. The theory was never wrong. It was merely sometimes insufficient. And then, gradually, in the late medieval period, the door opened. It did not open all at once. The Catholic Church, which governed much of intellectual life in medieval Europe, had long held reservations about the dissection of human bodies. The body was sacred. It would be needed again at the resurrection. To cut it open was to interfere with something that belonged to God. But the restrictions were more nuanced than they are often portrayed. Dissection for medical education was practiced cautiously in certain university towns, particularly in Italy, where the intellectual traditions of ancient Rome still cast long shadows. Bologna, Padua, Salerno. These were places where physicians began, quietly and with considerable institutional anxiety, to open the bodies of the dead and look inside. What they found was not what they expected, or rather, what they found was not what the texts had told them they would find. The ancient authorities, Galen most prominently, had described an interior anatomy that was partly observed and partly speculative, and the speculative parts had been accepted with the same reverence as the observed ones. When medieval physicians finally looked for themselves, they encountered discrepancies. The liver did not always have 5 lobes, as Galen had described. The heart did not always match the diagrams. The arrangement of vessels, nerves, and organs was more variable, more strange, and more magnificent than any inherited text had suggested. Galen himself had conducted much of his anatomical work on animals, on pigs and monkeys and dogs, and had extrapolated from those observations to human anatomy. This was not unreasonable, given the constraints of his time, but it meant that his human anatomy was, in places, wrong in ways that were systematic rather than random. The bones of the human sternum, for instance, he described as having 7 segments, the way a pig's sternum does. The human sternum has 3. This is the kind of error that is invisible when you are reading a text and immediately apparent when you are holding the actual bone in your hands. This should have been a triumphant moment, and in some ways it was. The anatomical work of Mondino de Luzzi in the early 14th century, and later the revolutionary investigations of Andreas Vesalius in the 16th, represent genuine landmarks in human understanding. But the medieval experience of this discovery, the early tentative pre-Vesalius experience, was something more complicated than triumph. Because what the early anatomists discovered was not just what the body contained. They discovered how little they understood about what to do with that knowledge. Imagine yourself in one of those early dissection theatres, not the grand tiered amphitheatres that would come later, but a smaller, colder space. A stone room somewhere in a university town in northern Italy, perhaps in the late 13th or early 14th century. The light is poor, coming from candles and whatever grey winter daylight can squeeze through narrow windows. The smell is significant. The body on the table has been obtained through channels that are best not examined too closely. A condemned criminal, perhaps, or someone whose family had no means to object. The physician stands at a distance. He holds a long pointer. He does not touch the body himself. That is the work of an assistant, a demonstrator, who cuts and lifts and separates while the physician reads aloud from Galen, pointing to structures as they appear. The students watch. They take notes. They learn. But here is the thing. When the demonstrator's hands reveal something that does not match the text being read aloud, the standard response was not to correct the text. The standard response was to assume the body was wrong, that this particular body was unusual, that Galen, who had been right for 1,000 years, could not be wrong now. The body on the table was the error. The ancient authority was the truth. This is the first great tragedy of medieval anatomical discovery. Not that people didn't look, but that when looking revealed something uncomfortable, the habit of deference to inherited knowledge was so deeply ingrained that the evidence of their own eyes was dismissed. The body was opened, the truth was visible, and it was, for a very long time, politely ignored. There is something almost dreamlike about this, about standing in a room with the evidence directly in front of you, your eyes receiving it, your hands perhaps even touching it, and still finding a way to not quite see it. But this is what institutions do to perception. They do not prevent looking. They shape what looking means. They provide the framework within which observation is interpreted. And if the framework is strong enough, it can survive almost any amount of contradictory evidence. The body on the table was wrong. Galen was right. This conclusion was reached not through logic, but through the deep grammar of institutional authority, which teaches you, before you're even aware of it, which things are allowed to be true. And yet the knowledge accumulated anyway, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous institutional resistance. The actual interior of the human body began to be mapped. And what that mapping revealed was something that changed the relationship between human beings and their own fragility forever. The body, it turned out, was not designed with maintenance in mind. This sounds like a joke, and in a way it is. But it is also one of the most profound and unsettling things that the medieval period discovered, and one of the things that its discovery made worse rather than better, at least in the short term. Once physicians understood, even imperfectly, where the organs were, they felt entitled to act on that knowledge. Surgery, which had always existed in crude and desperate forms, began to be practiced with a new confidence, a confidence that was not yet matched by any corresponding improvement in technique, hygiene, or understanding of what went wrong when things went wrong. Consider what surgery meant in the medieval world. No anesthesia in any modern sense. Alcohol, opium preparations, and a compound called dwale, a mixture that included hemlock and henbane, were sometimes used, with results that were inconsistent at best and fatal at worst. No understanding of infection or antisepsis, no germ theory, no sterile instruments. The knife that cut into one body might cut into the next without being cleaned. The hands of the surgeon might go directly from one wound to another. The relationship between contamination and death was entirely invisible to medieval practitioners, not because they were careless, but because the concept simply did not exist. Speed was the primary surgical virtue. The faster the procedure, the less blood was lost, the less pain was endured, and the less time the patient had to die on the table. A good surgeon was a fast surgeon. Accuracy was secondary. Survival was aspirational. And yet people submitted to this. They had to. When the alternative was dying of whatever condition required the surgery, the knife, however terrifying, was the better option. Medieval patients were not stupid. They were desperate. And desperation has always been one of the great engines of human endurance. The discovery of anatomy, then, did not immediately improve medicine. It improved confidence. And confidence, when combined with knives and no anesthesia and no understanding of infection, is a particularly dangerous quality. Medieval surgeons now felt entitled to cut, to explore, to intervene. They had seen the inside of the body. They knew, more or less, where things were. The problem was that knowing where things are does not tell you what to do when they go wrong. This mismatch between knowledge and wisdom, between the ability to see and the ability to understand, is one of the defining tragedies of medieval discovery. It would not be the last time this pattern appeared, because alongside the discovery of anatomy came another darker discovery, one that grew from the same soil of observation and experiment, but that grew in a direction that no one, looking back, would choose to celebrate. Medieval authorities discovered that pain was not random. It could be controlled. It could be extended. It could be applied in stages, with precision, with intention, with something that looked disturbingly like craft. This discovery did not happen in a single moment. It accumulated, the way all terrible knowledge accumulates, through practice and refinement, and the gradual realization that a thing being done could be done better. Punishment had always existed. Torture had always existed. But the medieval period brought something new to both. It brought method. The early medieval approach to punishment was largely theatrical. Public executions, floggings, brandings. These were spectacles of power designed to demonstrate the consequences of transgression and to remind the watching crowd where authority resided. They were brutal, but they were also, in a sense, crude. The goal was death or pain, applied quickly and visibly. But as medieval legal systems became more sophisticated, as the machinery of courts and confessions and evidence became more elaborate, something changed. Pain began to be understood not just as punishment, but as a tool for extracting information, a tool for producing confession, a tool, in the language of the time, for discovering the truth. The logic was internally consistent, if externally monstrous. A person who confessed under torture was confessing because they could not endure the pain. And they could not endure the pain because the pain was real. And if the pain was real, then the confession was real. Therefore, torture produced truth. This reasoning ignored the obvious fact that a person in sufficient pain will say anything to make the pain stop. They will confess to crimes they did not commit. They will name accomplices who do not exist. They will agree to any proposition offered to them if agreeing will end the suffering. This was known, or at least suspected, by some medieval thinkers. There are texts from the period that express reservations about the reliability of tortured confessions. But reservations did not carry the weight of institutional practice, and institutional practice had concluded that pain was an effective instrument of truth. What followed was a kind of optimization. Practitioners learned which methods produced the most information with the least permanent damage. They learned how to keep a subject conscious. They learned the difference between pain that broke a person and pain that merely persuaded them. They developed, with a diligence that is difficult to contemplate, a professional expertise in human suffering. This was not medieval chaos. This was medieval order. The people who administered judicial torture were not amateurs acting on impulse. They were trained professionals operating within legal frameworks, following prescribed procedures, stopping when the law required them to stop, or at least claiming to. Death during torture was generally considered a failure of craft. The goal was not to kill. The goal was to produce a confession, which was then used to justify whatever punishment the court had already decided upon. There is a particular quality of horror in efficiency. The random cruelty of a mob is terrible but comprehensible. The systematic, procedural, carefully documented cruelty of an institution is something else. It suggests that the worst things humans do to each other are not always the product of passion or chaos. Sometimes they are the product of careful thought, applied expertise, and the sincere belief that what is being done is necessary and just. Medieval Europe did not invent torture, but it discovered something about torture that changed how it would be practiced for centuries to come. It discovered that pain, applied with knowledge and method, was more effective than pain applied at random. It discovered that the body had thresholds that could be approached without crossing. It discovered that suffering could be calibrated, and once that was discovered, it was never undiscovered. The knowledge spread. It was written down. It was taught. It was refined. And while the specific legal frameworks of medieval torture eventually changed, the underlying insight that pain is a tool, that it can be controlled and directed and used, did not disappear with the Middle Ages. It learned to wear different clothes. It learned to speak in different languages, but it remained, as it has remained, one of the most persistent and most terrible things that human beings have ever learned about themselves. Perhaps what makes this discovery so difficult to sit with is not its cruelty, but its logic. The people who developed and refined these methods were not, by the standards of their world, acting irrationally. They were solving a problem. Courts needed confessions. Confessions required convincing. Pain was convincing. The system worked in the narrow sense that it produced the outcomes the system required. And a system that works, even a monstrous one, is extraordinarily difficult to dismantle from within, because every person inside it has been shaped by it, has learned to see through its assumptions, has internalized its definitions of necessity and truth. This is worth sitting with in the quiet, not because it is comfortable, but because it is instructive. The gap between a system that works and a system that is good is one of the most dangerous gaps in human history. And the medieval period walked directly into that gap with its eyes open and called what it found there justice. If any of these hidden histories are stirring something in you, I want to hear about it. Drop a comment and tell me which of these medieval discoveries unsettles you most, or whether you have noticed this same pattern, knowledge arriving before wisdom, somewhere else in history. The archive grows richer when you add your voice to it. Let us move now from the body in isolation to the body in community, because there is another discovery from the medieval period that is, in its own way, equally unsettling. One that began with observation and ended with fear. One that was, in its initial form, absolutely correct, and that nevertheless produced consequences that were catastrophic. Medieval people discovered that disease moves. This sounds simple. It sounds like something that should have been obvious, but consider what it meant in a world that had no germ theory, no understanding of microorganisms, no concept of viral or bacterial transmission. In that world, illness was understood as something that happened to individuals. It was a divine judgment, or an imbalance of humours, or the influence of malign stars, or the consequence of moral failing. It arrived in a person the way misfortune arrived in a person, from outside, from above, from fate. But it was not understood to travel from person to person in any direct physical sense. And then the evidence became impossible to ignore. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, and within 4 years it had killed somewhere between a third and half of the continent's population. The numbers are so large they are difficult to hold in the mind. Imagine every other person you know, gone. Imagine every other house on every street you have ever walked down, empty. Imagine the silence that would follow, not the comfortable silence of a quiet night, but the silence of absence, of loss, so total it becomes a kind of landscape. The Black Death was not the first epidemic medieval Europe had faced, but it was the one that made the pattern undeniable. Disease moved. It travelled along trade routes. It followed the paths of merchants and soldiers and pilgrims. It arrived in port cities and spread inland. It crossed mountains and rivers and borders. It did not respect the boundaries of individual bodies. It moved between them. Consider what this meant for the medieval understanding of the world. If disease moved between people, then proximity was danger. The neighbour who coughed, the merchant who arrived from the east, the pilgrim who had passed through a dozen towns before reaching yours. Every human connection, every act of care, every gathering for worship or trade or celebration became a potential vector for death. The social fabric of medieval life, which was densely woven, which depended on proximity and community, and the constant exchange of goods and words and touch, became the very mechanism by which catastrophe spread. This observation, which was correct, which was genuinely a medical insight of profound importance, produced a response that was partly useful and largely catastrophic. The partly useful response was quarantine. The word itself comes from the medieval period, from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the period during which ships arriving in Venetian ports were required to wait before their crews could come ashore. This practice, which emerged in the mid-14th century in response to the plague, was based on the correct intuition that isolation could slow the spread of disease. It worked imperfectly, inconsistently, but better than nothing. But the catastrophic response was blame. Because if disease moved from person to person, then someone had to be spreading it. And in a world that was already fractured by religious tension, economic inequality, and the particular human tendency to find explanations for suffering in the actions of others, the question of who was spreading the disease had an answer that was arrived at with terrible speed. Jewish communities across Europe were accused of poisoning wells. This accusation, which was entirely false, which had no basis in evidence, which was in fact contradicted by the evidence, since Jewish communities died of the plague at similar rates to Christian ones, led to massacres that killed tens of thousands of people. In Strasbourg, in Basel, in Mainz, in dozens of other cities, Jewish populations were burned alive or expelled in response to a disease they had not caused and could not have caused. The discovery that disease was contagious did not, in the medieval context, lead to a careful examination of how contagion worked. It led to a search for the contagious person. And once you are looking for a person to blame rather than a mechanism to understand, you will find one. You will always find one. Because blame is easy and mechanism is hard, and in the middle of a catastrophe, with the dead piling up faster than they can be buried, hard is not what people reach for. There were medieval thinkers who resisted this. There were physicians who argued for more careful observation, who noticed that isolation helped, who tried to understand the pattern of spread rather than simply naming a cause. But they were working against the current of fear, which is the strongest current there is. The discovery of contagion, then, is one of those medieval insights that was simultaneously correct and catastrophic. Correct in its observation that disease traveled between people. Catastrophic in the conclusions that observation was used to support. The knowledge was real. The application of that knowledge was shaped by everything else that medieval people believed, feared, and needed to be true. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval discovery. It did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a world of belief, of hierarchy, of fear, of faith. And the world it happened inside shaped what the discoveries meant and what they were used for. Knowledge does not arrive clean. It arrives contaminated by the context that produced it. And the context of the medieval world was one in which fear was a more powerful force than curiosity, and certainty was more valued than accuracy. Now let us descend. Literally, let us follow the miners down into the earth, because there is a discovery that happened underground, in the dark, in the places where medieval people went to extract the metals that built their world. And it is a discovery that came at a terrible cost. Medieval Europe was built on metal, iron for weapons and tools, copper for coins and vessels, lead for pipes and roofing, silver for trade, gold for everything that gold has always been for. The mines that produced these metals were some of the most economically important sites in the medieval world. and they were worked by men who descended into the earth every day and came back up. When they came back up, changed. The miners noticed things. They noticed that certain shafts made them dizzy, that candles went out for no apparent reason in certain chambers, that men who worked in particular areas of certain mines developed tremors or coughs or a kind of slow, inexorable decline that ended in death. They noticed that some mines seemed cursed, that the earth in some places was hostile in ways that the earth in other places was not. They were right. The earth was hostile, but not in the way they understood it. What the miners were encountering, without any framework to understand it, was the reality of toxic gases. Carbon dioxide, which accumulates in low-lying areas of mines and displaces oxygen. Carbon monoxide, which is produced by combustion and is invisible and odorless and kills without warning. Methane, which is explosive. Arsenic and sulfur compounds, which are produced by certain ore deposits and cause slow, cumulative poisoning. The mines were full of invisible death, and the miners walked into it every day because they had no choice and no knowledge. The candles that went out were going out because there was not enough oxygen to sustain combustion. The men who grew dizzy were being deprived of oxygen or poisoned by carbon monoxide. The tremors and the coughs and the slow decline were the symptoms of chronic exposure to toxic substances that the miners breathed in with every breath they took underground. Medieval understanding of this was, of necessity, metaphorical. The mines were inhabited by spirits. The underground had its own moods, its own angers. The Berggeist, the mountain spirit of German mining folklore, was a figure who could be benevolent or malevolent, who could lead miners to rich veins or lead them to their deaths. When a shaft was particularly deadly, it was because the spirit was angry. When a mine was particularly productive, it was because the spirit was pleased. This was not stupidity. This was the human mind doing what the human mind does when it encounters phenomena it cannot explain. It builds a story. It creates an agent. It assigns intention to what is actually mechanism. The miners could not see the carbon dioxide that was killing them. They could see the candles going out. And a candle going out in a dark mine is one of the most frightening things imaginable, because it means you are now in complete darkness underground, with no way to see where the shaft goes, or what is in front of you, or how to get back to the surface. The stories they built around these experiences were not irrational given what they knew. They were the best available explanations for phenomena that had no other explanation. But here is what makes this discovery particularly haunting. The miners were, in their way, doing science. They were observing. They were recording. They were developing practices based on those observations. They learned, for instance, that certain types of rock were more likely to be associated with dangerous air. They learned that particular smells were warning signs. They developed a kind of empirical knowledge of the underground that was practical and sometimes life-saving, even if the theoretical framework surrounding it was entirely wrong. Imagine a miner in the silver mines of the Harz Mountains in the 12th century, descending before dawn with a tallow candle and a leather satchel of tools. The shaft goes down at an angle, the walls close and damp, the air growing heavier with every step. He has been doing this for 20 years. He knows this mine the way you know a house you grew up in, by feel, by smell, by the particular quality of the silence in different chambers. He knows which passages feel wrong. He knows where the candle flame shrinks and dims before going out entirely. He knows which of his colleagues developed the cough and which of them recovered and which of them did not. He does not know why. He has no framework for why, but he knows the pattern, and the pattern is knowledge, even when the explanation is missing. He carries that knowledge in his body, in his habits, in the way he pauses at the entrance to certain chambers and holds his candle out in front of him before committing his full weight to the step forward. This is empirical knowledge, incomplete, untheorized, wrapped in folklore, but real. And it is the foundation on which, centuries later, a more complete understanding would eventually be built. The canary in the coal mine is a practice that comes from a much later period, but it represents the culmination of a kind of reasoning that began in the medieval mines. If a small creature dies, the air is dangerous. You cannot see the danger, you cannot smell it, but you can see the creature, and so the creature becomes a detector, a living instrument for measuring something that your senses cannot directly perceive. This is a profound piece of reasoning. It is, in its structure, exactly the kind of indirect measurement that underlies much of modern science. You cannot see the thing you want to measure, so you measure something that responds to it, and you infer the thing from the response. The medieval miners did not have the theory, but they had the practice. They had learned, through terrible experience, that the underground world contained dangers that were real but invisible, and that the only way to navigate those dangers was to pay attention to everything, including the things that seemed unrelated. The tragedy is that this knowledge was not enough. The mines continued to kill, the toxic gases continued to accumulate. The men continued to descend because the metal was needed, and the men were available, and the connection between the underground air and the deaths that followed was never clearly enough established to change the practice. People knew the mines were dangerous. They did not know why, in a way that would have allowed them to make them safer. And so the knowledge sat there, incomplete, wrapped in folklore, passed down through generations of miners who knew that certain places underground would kill you, but could not say exactly how or why. The discovery was real, the understanding was partial, and the gap between them was filled with the bodies of men who went into the earth and did not come back. Now we come to the metals themselves, because the medieval period made another discovery underground, one that was not about the air in the mines, but about what the mines produced. And this discovery is one of the strangest and most persistent in human history. The discovery that certain beautiful, useful, powerful substances were also quietly and invisibly killing the people who used them. Mercury was the first. And Mercury is worth dwelling on, because the relationship between medieval people and Mercury is one of the most revealing windows into how human beings relate to things that are simultaneously wonderful and deadly. Mercury is extraordinary. It is the only metal that is liquid at room temperature. It moves with a quality that is unlike any other substance, pooling and flowing and separating and recombining with a kind of liquid intelligence that is genuinely mesmerizing. It reflects light with a perfection that no other surface quite matches. It is heavy in a way that feels wrong, denser than it looks, with a weight that seems to contradict its fluidity. And it is silver, which in the medieval world was the color of the moon. of purity, of celestial significance. Alchemists loved mercury. They called it quicksilver, quick meaning alive, because it seemed alive in a way that other metals did not. They believed it was the prima materia, the first matter, the substance from which all other metals were derived and into which they could, with sufficient art and knowledge, be transformed. The philosopher's stone, that legendary substance that could transmute base metals into gold, was thought by many alchemical traditions to be derived from mercury. To work with mercury was to work with the fundamental stuff of the universe. This belief led alchemists to spend enormous amounts of time in close contact with mercury. They heated it, which produces mercury vapor, which is highly toxic. They dissolved it in acids, which produces mercury compounds, which are highly toxic. They handled it directly, which allows absorption through the skin, which causes mercury poisoning. They worked in enclosed spaces with poor ventilation, which concentrated the vapors. They breathed it in. They absorbed it through their hands. They ingested it accidentally and sometimes deliberately. And they got sick. They trembled. Their hands shook. Their speech slurred. Their moods became erratic and unpredictable. Their memory deteriorated. Some went mad in the specific, recognizable way that chronic mercury poisoning produces madness. The phrase mad as a hatter comes from a later period, from the felt hat industry where mercury was used in the curing process, but the phenomenon it describes was present in the medieval alchemical tradition. Mercury made people strange. It made them brilliant and erratic, and ultimately, often, destroyed them. But the medieval interpretation of these symptoms was not that mercury was poisonous. The interpretation was that mercury was powerful, that the symptoms of exposure were the symptoms of transformation, that the trembling hands and the disordered mind were the signs of someone who was working with forces too large for the ordinary human body to contain without consequence. To be made strange by mercury was to be made special by it. The madness was not a warning, it was a credential. This is a pattern that appears throughout the history of human interaction with toxic substances. The very power of the substance, the fact that it visibly changes the people who use it, is taken as evidence of its potency rather than its danger. If mercury can do this to a person, imagine what it can do to metal. If it can transform the mind, perhaps it can transform matter. The symptoms of poisoning are reinterpreted as evidence of efficacy. Medieval physicians made this same error with even more immediate consequences. Mercury was prescribed for a remarkable range of conditions: skin diseases, parasitic infections, syphilis, which arrived in Europe in the late 15th century and was treated with mercury preparations for the next 400 years. The treatment for syphilis was, in many cases, worse than the disease. Patients were rubbed with mercury ointments. They were placed in heated rooms to sweat out the illness, which also increased the absorption of mercury vapor. They lost their teeth. They drooled. They trembled. They suffered neurological damage that was indistinguishable from the late stages of the disease they were being treated for. And they sometimes recovered from the syphilis. Because mercury does have some antimicrobial properties, and because the immune system, given time, can sometimes suppress the infection, and when they recovered, the mercury got the credit. The trembling, the tooth loss, the neurological symptoms were the price of the cure. A high price, certainly, but the cure worked, didn't it? The patient survived. The mercury was vindicated. This is the cruelest kind of medical discovery, the kind where the treatment has just enough efficacy to obscure its harm, where the patients who survive provide evidence for the treatment and the patients who don't are attributed to the severity of the disease, where the side effects are visible but the connection between cause and effect is hidden behind the complexity of a sick body in which many things are going wrong simultaneously. Mercury was not the only such substance. Lead followed closely behind. Lead is, in many ways, the more insidious of the two. Mercury, at least, has the decency to be dramatic. It trembles and flows and produces visible, recognizable symptoms. Lead is quieter. It accumulates slowly. Its effects emerge over years and decades. It dulls the mind gradually, the way a candle dims rather than the way a candle is snuffed. And it was everywhere in the medieval world. Absolutely everywhere. Lead pipes carried water. Lead vessels held wine. Lead glazes coated the pottery that food was cooked and served in. Lead compounds were used in cosmetics. Lead was added to wine deliberately as a sweetener, a practice inherited from ancient Rome, where it was common enough to have probably contributed to the cognitive decline of several emperors. Lead was used in paint, in construction, in the weights that kept fishing nets submerged, and the weights that kept scales balanced. Medieval people were bathed in lead from birth. They drank it with their water. They ate it with their food. They applied it to their faces in the form of white lead powder, which was the fashionable cosmetic of the period, producing a pale, aristocratic complexion that was considered beautiful, and that was slowly, imperceptibly, poisoning the people who wore it. The effects of chronic low-level lead exposure are subtle and cumulative. They include reduced intelligence, impaired memory, difficulty with impulse control, increased aggression, fatigue, and a general dulling of cognitive function. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They simply make people slightly less capable than they would otherwise have been, slightly more prone to poor decisions, slightly less able to learn and remember and reason clearly. Imagine a civilization in which a significant portion of the population is chronically, mildly, cognitively impaired by a substance they cannot see, taste, or smell, that is present in virtually everything they eat and drink and touch. Imagine trying to understand why people seem to be making worse decisions than they should, why children are not developing as quickly as they might, why certain populations seem to be declining in ways that cannot be attributed to any specific cause. Medieval people could not see this. They had no framework for it. The connection between the lead in the water pipes and the trembling in the hands was not one that could be made without a theory of toxic accumulation that did not exist. And so the lead remained. It remained in the pipes and the pots and the wine and the cosmetics. It remained in the bodies of the people who used these things. And it shaped invisibly and irresistibly the cognitive landscape of an entire civilization. This is perhaps the most unsettling of all the medieval discoveries, not because it was made, but because it was not. The discovery that lead was poisoning everyone was not made in the Middle Ages. It was suspected, occasionally, in fragments. The Roman physician Dioscorides had noted that lead was harmful if consumed. Certain medieval physicians expressed concerns about the safety of lead vessels, but these concerns were never assembled into a coherent understanding, never translated into policy, never used to change the practices that were causing the harm. The discovery that should have been made was not made, and the harm continued. There is something deeply melancholy about this, about knowledge that was close enough to touch, that was in some sense available, that existed in fragments, in texts and observations, and the lived experience of people who noticed that something was wrong, but that was never assembled into the form that would have allowed it to be acted upon. The discovery was there, waiting to be made, and it wasn't, and people suffered for centuries as a result. Let us turn now from what was inside the body to what was outside it, from the substances that medieval people carried within themselves to the world they looked out at and tried to understand, because the medieval period made discoveries not only about the human body but about the earth itself, and some of those discoveries were equally troubling in their implications. The medieval world had a geography. It was a geography inherited from ancient sources, from Ptolemy and from the Bible and from the accounts of travelers who had gone to the edges of the known world and returned with stories. This geography placed Jerusalem at the center of the world, literally, on medieval Mappae Mundi, the great world maps of the period. It placed the known continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, in their proper positions. It placed at the edges of the world the places where the known shaded into the unknown, where the maps became uncertain and the sea monsters appeared. And then the edges began to change. The medieval period was a time of extraordinary geographical exploration, much of it conducted not by Europeans, but by Arab and Chinese navigators and scholars whose contributions to geographical knowledge are often overlooked in the standard narratives. Arab geographers like al-Idrisi produced maps of the world that were more accurate than anything produced in contemporary Europe. Al-Idrisi worked at the court of Roger II of Sicily in the 12th century, drawing on the accounts of hundreds of travelers and traders to produce a world map that depicted the coastlines of Africa and Asia with a precision that European cartographers would not match for centuries. Chinese navigators under Zheng He in the early 15th century sailed to the coast of Africa and possibly further. The world was being mapped from multiple directions with increasing accuracy and increasing ambition. But the maps did not talk to each other. The knowledge accumulated in one tradition did not flow easily into another. The world was being understood, but the understandings were fragmented, held in separate archives that rarely communicated. But within the European tradition, there is a particular discovery, or rather a series of discoveries, that stands out for the strangeness of its implications. The discovery of lands that were not supposed to exist. The Norse settlement of North America is the most documented of these. Leif Erikson's voyage to Vinland in approximately 1000 CE is attested by the Icelandic sagas and confirmed by archaeology at Lance O'Meadows in Newfoundland, where the remains of a Norse settlement have been excavated and dated. The Norse knew that there was land to the west of Greenland. They visited it. They attempted to settle it. They encountered the indigenous people who lived there, whom they called Skraelings, and the encounters were sometimes peaceful and sometimes violent, and ultimately the settlements did not persist. But the knowledge persisted, at least in the Norse world. The sagas preserved it. The memory of Vinland survived. And this raises a question that is genuinely puzzling. Why didn't this knowledge change European geography? Why didn't the Norse discovery of North America become part of the medieval European understanding of the world? The answer is partly about communication. The Norse world was geographically peripheral to the centers of medieval European intellectual life. The sagas were written in Old Norse, a language not widely read outside Scandinavia and Iceland. The settlements in Vinland were small, short-lived, and far from any major population center. There was no infrastructure to carry the news from the edge of the Norse world to the libraries of Paris or Bologna or Toledo. But there is something else here too, something about the nature of knowledge and the conditions under which it spreads. A discovery, no matter how real, no matter how well documented, does not become part of the shared understanding of a civilization unless it is absorbed into the frameworks that civilization uses to organize knowledge. The Norse knew about Vinland, but Vinland did not fit into the geographical frameworks that medieval European scholars used to understand the world. It was not in Ptolemy. It was not in the Bible. It was not on the Mappae Mundi. And so, even if scholars had heard rumors of it, they had no place to put it, no framework to absorb it. It remained at the edge, real but unintegrated, known but not understood. This is a different kind of failed discovery, not a discovery that was made and suppressed, not a discovery that was made and misapplied, but a discovery that was made and simply could not be heard, because the world that heard it had no place for it. And yet the maps were changing. Slowly, imperfectly, the edges of the medieval world were being pushed outward. Portuguese navigators were working their way down the coast of Africa. Arab trade routes were bringing goods from places that European geography had not yet named. The world was larger than the inherited maps suggested, and the evidence for that largeness was accumulating. Consider the Vinland map, a document that has been the subject of extraordinary controversy since it surfaced in the 1950s. The map, which purports to date from the mid-15th century, shows a landmass in the Western Atlantic labelled as Vinland, the island discovered by Bjarni and Leif in company. If genuine, it would be the earliest known cartographic representation of the Americas. It would suggest that knowledge of the Norse discoveries had, in some form, reached the mainstream of European cartography before Columbus. The authenticity of the Vinland map has been debated for decades. Chemical analyses have produced contradictory results. Scholars have argued about the ink, the parchment, the style, the provenance. The current consensus leans toward it being a forgery, probably created in the 20th century. But the debate has never been entirely settled, and the question it raises, the question of what medieval cartographers knew and when they knew it, remains genuinely open. But the Vinland map is almost a distraction from the larger question. The larger question is not whether this specific map is genuine. The larger question is what it means that the medieval world contained, scattered through its texts and its archives and its oral traditions, fragments of geographical knowledge that its official maps did not reflect. What it means that the world was being discovered and rediscovered, that knowledge was being accumulated and then lost, that the edges of the known world were being pushed outward and then sometimes allowed to snap back. Because this is another pattern that the medieval period reveals. Knowledge does not accumulate steadily. It is not simply added to what came before, building toward an ever more complete picture. It can be lost. It can be forgotten. It can exist in fragments that are never assembled. It can be real and documented and still fail to change the understanding of the people who most needed to hear it. The Norse knew about North America. Arab geographers knew more about the shape of the world than European cartographers did. Medieval miners knew that certain underground environments were deadly. Medieval physicians knew that some substances caused harm. Medieval anatomists could see with their own eyes that the ancient texts were wrong. And none of this knowledge, or very little of it, translated into the changes that would have made the medieval world safer, more accurate, more humane. Why? This is the question that sits at the center of all these medieval discoveries. Why did knowledge fail to produce understanding? Why did discovery fail to produce change? Part of the answer is institutional. The medieval world was organized around inherited authority. The church, the ancient texts, the established hierarchies of knowledge. To challenge these was not merely an intellectual act, it was a social and sometimes a physical risk. Scholars who contradicted Galen risked their professional standing. Miners who questioned the practices of the mine risked their livelihood. Physicians who suggested that the treatments they were using were causing harm risked the accusation that they were abandoning their patients. Part of the answer is structural. The medieval world lacked the institutions that allow knowledge to accumulate and spread. Universities existed, but they were focused on preserving and transmitting inherited knowledge rather than generating new knowledge. Printing had not yet arrived in Europe. Knowledge traveled slowly, incompletely, and was subject to loss at every stage of transmission. A discovery made in one place might take generations to reach another place, if it reached it at all. And part of the answer is simply human. Human beings are not primarily truth-seeking creatures. We are primarily comfort-seeking creatures. And comfort often requires the maintenance of existing beliefs rather than their revision. The discovery that the body is fragile and poorly assembled is not a comfortable discovery. The discovery that the air can kill you is not a comfortable discovery. The discovery that the substances you use every day are slowly poisoning you is not a comfortable discovery. And when a discovery is uncomfortable, the human mind has many tools for resisting it. We explain it away. We attribute it to exceptional circumstances. We blame it on something else. We defer to the authority that tells us the discovery is wrong. We keep using the lead pipes because the alternative is too expensive. We keep mining the dangerous shaft because the metal is needed. We keep prescribing mercury because the patients sometimes recover. We keep torturing because the confessions are so useful. We keep doing the things that the evidence tells us are harmful because the evidence is inconvenient and the habits are old and the systems that depend on those habits are powerful. This is not a medieval failure. This is a human failure, and it is one that the medieval period illustrates with particular clarity, precisely because the distance of time allows us to see it. We can see from where we stand that the lead was poisonous. We can see that the mercury was causing harm. We can see that the tortured confessions were unreliable. We can see that the Norse had reached America. We can see these things because we have the frameworks, the science, the accumulated knowledge of subsequent centuries that allow us to interpret the evidence correctly. But we should be careful about the confidence this produces, because the people of the medieval period could not see what we can see, and we cannot see what the people of some future century will see. We have our own lead pipes, our own Mercury, our own tortured confessions and ignored coastlines, the things that are obvious to the future and invisible to us, the discoveries we are failing to make or making and failing to hear, or hearing and failing to act upon. The medieval world is not a warning about the past. It is a mirror for the present. And if that thought is keeping you awake right now, I would love to know what discovery you think our own age is failing to hear. Leave it in the comments. Sometimes the most important questions are the ones we are all circling without quite naming them. Let us return now to where we began, to the question of what it means to discover something that you wish you hadn't, to the knowledge that arrives before the wisdom to handle it, to the door that opens and offers no instructions for what comes next. The medieval period was full of these moments, and what they share, all of them, is a particular quality of irreversibility. Once you have seen inside the body, you cannot unsee it. Once you have learned that disease travels between people, you cannot unlearn it. Once you have discovered that pain can be calibrated and controlled, that knowledge does not go away. Once you have found a coastline that should not exist, the world is permanently larger than it was. This is the nature of discovery. It changes the discoverer. And sometimes the change is not what the discoverer would have chosen. But here is what is worth holding on to. In the dark, in the quiet, as the night deepens around you. The medieval discoverers, for all the harm that their discoveries sometimes caused, for all the ways that knowledge arrived before wisdom, for all the failures of understanding and application and institutional resistance, they were doing something essential. They were looking, they were paying attention. They were refusing to accept that the world was exactly as the inherited text described it. The physician who opened the body and found that Galen was wrong was doing something brave. The miner who noticed that certain shafts were deadly and tried to understand why was doing something important. The geographer who looked at the edges of the known world and suspected that there was more beyond them, was doing something necessary. Even the alchemist who poisoned himself with mercury was, in his way, reaching towards something real. The substances of the world do transform. Matter does change. The universe is not static. He was wrong about the details, but he was right about the impulse. Knowledge is not safe. It has never been safe. Every discovery carries the seed of its own misuse, its own misunderstanding, its own premature application. The history of human knowledge is not a smooth ascent toward clarity. It is a jagged, painful, often tragic journey through error and correction and error again. The medieval period is simply one particularly vivid stretch of that journey. One where the errors were large and visible and the corrections were slow in coming. But the journey continued, the knowledge accumulated, the errors were eventually corrected, or most of them were. The lead pipes were eventually replaced. The mercury was eventually recognized as poison. The torture was eventually, in most places, abandoned as a legal instrument. The coastlines of the Americas were eventually mapped. The body was eventually understood well enough to be healed. Eventually, after enormous cost, after generations of suffering that might have been avoided if the knowledge had arrived differently, or if the wisdom to handle it had arrived alongside it. Perhaps that is what the medieval discoveries teach us. Not that knowledge is dangerous, though it can be. Not that discovery is to be feared, though it can be frightening. But that the gap between knowing and understanding is where most of the harm lives. That the most important work is not the discovery itself, but the long, slow, painful work of integrating what has been discovered into a framework wise enough to use it well. The medieval world was not stupid. It was not primitive. It was not a dark age in any meaningful sense of the term. It was a world full of intelligent, curious, capable people who were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had and the frameworks available to them. And it was a world in which the discoveries kept coming, faster than the wisdom to handle them, piling up in the archives of human experience, waiting for the future to make sense of them. We are the future they were waiting for. We are the inheritors of their discoveries, the beneficiaries of their suffering, the readers of their incomplete and sometimes terrible files. And we sit here, in the dark, in the quiet, with our own incomplete files and our own unprocessed discoveries and our own gaps between knowing and understanding, doing the same thing they did, the best we can with what we have. There is something both humbling and comforting in that. Humbling because it reminds us that we are not the end of the story, that the future will look back at us the way we look back at medieval Europe, with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation, wondering why we couldn't see what was so obvious from their vantage point. Comforting because it means we are part of something continuous, something that extends backward through the medieval period and forward into a future we cannot see, a long, slow, imperfect accumulation of understanding. The archive is not closed. It was never closed. It keeps receiving new files, new discoveries, new things we wish we hadn't found and cannot put back. And somewhere in the future, someone is sitting in the dark, reading our files, trying to understand what we knew and what we missed and what we could not bring ourselves to hear. The mines are quiet now. The alchemical furnaces have gone cold. The dissection theatres are empty, their stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The maps have been redrawn so many times that the original errors are barely visible beneath the corrections. The medieval world is done with its discovering. It has passed its files to us, complete with all the errors and all the tragedies and all the moments of genuine, costly, irreversible insight. We keep them here, in the archive. We read them in the night, when the day's certainties have softened and the mind is open to what it might otherwise refuse to hear. We read them not because they are comfortable, but because they are true. And truth, even the uncomfortable kind, even the kind that arrives before its time, even the kind that costs more than anyone wanted to pay, is the only thing in the archive worth keeping. The lights in the old dissection theatre have long since gone out. The Mercury has cooled and stilled. The maps are folded, their edges soft with age. The mines are sealed, their dangerous air contained at last. And somewhere beneath all of it, in the deep quiet of accumulated time, the medieval world rests, its discoveries made, its lessons offered, its files available to anyone willing to read them in the dark. You are willing. You are here. And that is enough. If you find yourself awake again on a quiet night when sleep will not come, let this one play again. The layers have a way of revealing themselves differently with each listen, and something you half heard tonight may settle into meaning when the hour is later and the world is stiller. And if someone you know carries a quiet curiosity about the things history almost forgot, send this to them. Every time these hidden truths find a new listener, something worth remembering gets preserved a little longer. That is not a small thing. Let the archive hold you for a while. Let the weight of all that accumulated knowing settle gently around you, not as a burden, but as a kind of ballast. The past is heavy, yes, but heavy things can be steadying. They can keep you grounded when the world feels uncertain. They can remind you that uncertainty is not new, that the gap between knowing and understanding has always been wide, and that people have always been crossing it imperfectly and bravely and at great cost, and that somehow the crossing continues. The night is deep now, the archive is quiet, the files are closed for tonight, and the knowledge they contain is resting in the dark alongside you. Tomorrow, there will be more discovering, more doors opening onto rooms that offer no instruction, more knowledge arriving before wisdom, more irreversible moments of understanding that change everything and improve nothing, at least not immediately, at least not in ways that are visible to the people living through them. But that is tomorrow. Tonight, the archive is still. The medieval world has said what it had to say. The discoveries have been made and noted and filed. And you are here, in the dark, having listened, having heard, having let the weight of it settle into the quiet space between waking and sleep. Rest now. The archive will be here when you return. The files will still be waiting. The questions will still be open. And the long, slow, imperfect work of understanding will continue, as it always has, as it always will, one careful, costly, irreversible discovery at a time. There is another file the archive has been keeping. The lost diaries of Columbus's crew reveal what the official record was never meant to show, what the men who made that crossing actually saw, feared, and wrote down when no one of authority was watching. The archive is waiting for you there.